Good afternoon, everybody. As usual, we'll wait just a minute here while we let folks in from the waiting room before we get started. So hang on just a minute. Mhm. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started, even though we have some folks who will be joining us as we go along. I'm Dave Carter, along with our my fellow regional director, Chris Roper, Flowery Hill Institute, and we're really pleased to have with us today Lori Demerit, the owner and CEO of the Hartman Group. And I've had the pleasure of working with the Hartman Group for about 30 years. They're a fantastic resource in the marketplace. And so we're just really pleased that Lori has agreed to join us and share some of her expertise on what's happening in the marketplace today. So, just a couple of things before we get started. As usual, we are recording this. It'll be archived on our website, and so it's available for download. For those that weren't able to join us today, they can download it and watch it. Also, you will be receiving a two-question survey after the roundtable. Uh, First of all, what did you think of today's session? And secondly, what would you like to see us cover moving forward? Those are really important. So just take a minute to give us your feedback after we're done. And then as we go forward, just type your questions into the Q&A box. Chris and I will keep our eye on that. And as we go along, we'll try and pass along as many questions as we can. In fact, we had one attendee email us a series of questions. I don't know that we'll get to all of them, but we're really pleased that those came in. That really helps us put this together. So, Chris, anything else we need to cover before we jump in?
We just welcome everyone and thank you all for joining us. Lori, for your benefit, we have folks from all around the United States, including Virgin Islands, it looks like on the call right now. So just know, your broad market base, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of great questions here. But thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Lori, let's just start off. Introduce yourself and fill us in a little bit on the Hartman Group.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate and look forward to having an engaging conversation. I am the owner and CEO of Hartman, which is a market research and consulting firm, and we specialize specifically just in food and beverage. And so for many years, we have studied the American consumer. And to do that, we get to do all sorts of fun things like follow them around in grocery stores with their knowledge. We're not stalking them. We go with them on shopping trips and we get to ask them questions about what they're doing. We go into their homes. And so when they're cooking an actual meal, we're with them just sort of chatting. If they let us, we start looking at their pantries, their cupboards, their fridges to see what's there. And those folks who tell us they're super healthy, those are where we always find the hidden Cheetos and Cokes and such in the cupboards. But in all seriousness, it gives us a really great look and an understanding of why consumers make the decisions they do, what's driving it. Some of those things are really hard for them to talk about. So sometimes those are long conversations, but we want to understand their true behavior and their needs. So we have a team of ethnographers who go into the homes, go into stores. We also do a lot of quantitative research. So I'll be sharing with you some of those numbers today because we want to make sure that anything we find is projectable to the US. So we all have our idiosyncrasies and sort of our atypical things that we do, but there's also a lot of commonalities that we share in terms of what our beliefs are, what we value, how we shop. And so that's what we really want to understand, or what are some of those things that everyone's sort of participating in. But importantly, where is that consumer going that's a little ahead of the rest of us, right? So that person who's sort of doing the things in health and wellness before everyone else is. So our firm studies the American consumer and American culture, and then we share that information with our clients who primarily are food manufacturers, food retailers, and food service providers as well.
Great. Appreciate that, Lori. And yeah, and I know one of the things with Hartman, you really focus on health and wellness in the food marketplace. That's really important information. So we're calling this Not Your Parents' Meat and Poultry Marketplace. And I know you've been on top of a lot of demographic changes and how that's affecting the marketplace. Tell us a little bit about what you see happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some interesting things going on. One kind of big one is just when you look at census numbers, seeing how the American household is changing. And what we see happening there is that there's actually a declining number of households with kids in the US today. It's going down pretty sharply. There's only about 28% of households now that have a kid under the age of 18. Now, the flip side of that is there are an increasing number of households that are single person households, which I think presents some unique opportunities, right? From a marketing standpoint, how do we satisfy someone who's just buying for one? We also see households growing where they're multi-generational. So there's multi-generations of adults living in that household. So a lot of different preferences and habits and behaviors. And so we like to think about the household not being this kind of typical American household of two adults and two kids, but all these differing types of households that are going to have different needs when it comes to portion sizing, when it comes to their preferences around meat, et cetera. We also like to understand how people shop in a household. And for most households with two adults in there, both people are doing some of the shopping. So gone is the day for most households where just one person was doing the shopping, typically the female head of household. Now we find absolutely that female still does some shopping, but the males in households typically do some shopping. Those older teenagers do some shopping. If there's a parent of an adult living there, they're doing some shopping. So we have all these people who are now self-identifying as the primary shopper and making different decisions in the household. We also see things that are happening to do with culture, different cultural heritage, where we're coming from, what styles of meat do we want, what do we want to eat, differing diets. So 61% of all Americans have followed some sort of customized eating routine in the past year. So that's changing how we eat. So there's a lot of cultural changes that are both obvious, right? Things like changing household size, and a little bit more subtle that consumers don't really think about. And yet all those things, all these cultural changes are impacting how consumers' preferences are being formed today.
Great. Great. So one of the things that is, I guess, sort of a dichotomy right now is, we have record high beef prices, and generally in the marketplace, when you say, "Oh my God, the prices are going up," that your demand is going to decline. But we're also seeing record high demand for not only beef but for other animal proteins. And what do you see kind of behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, number one, taste, right? We got to say it. We don't always acknowledge it, but we got to say it. Taste always matters. Consumers who tell you that taste doesn't matter are usually lying, or they're one of the 1 or 2% of all of us who really don't care about taste and willing to do anything. And so taste is king and always will be. And I think we have to admit that. I think especially in our category, that's a huge plus for us, right? Consumers like the taste. Most consumers like the taste of meat. I think the second thing that's also extremely important is just this constant demand for protein. So we've been measuring the protein marketplace for many, many years. We did a survey earlier this year on health and wellness. We asked consumers, what nutrients are you seeking? What ingredients are you seeking in your diet? And we asked about, I think it was like 35 different things. Number one was protein out of everything. 75% of all adult consumers say they're deliberately trying to add more protein for their diet. So, right, 75% is a huge number. If we look back to 2023, so just 2 years ago, that number has increased by 12%. So a 12-point increase just in 2 years. And so this demand for protein that we thought even a couple years ago may have finally plateaued, it seems like it has not. And so protein is being attributed by consumers to lead to satiety, so being full for longer, to building muscle mass, which so many consumers are trying to do, to having implications, positive ones for weight management and control because of the satiety. So there's all these really positive attributions around protein, and this constant demand for protein seems to be increasing. And I should note, it is diversifying the types of protein consumers are thinking about too. And even specifically animal protein, we've seen an 8-point increase in consumers saying that they're trying to add more animal protein to their diet from 2023 to 2025. So I think you're absolutely right, Dave, to point out, the demand's increasing and yet pricing is going up too. But because protein is seen as so important to the US diet, especially for health reasons, that consumers are willing to pay for it because they see the value of it. And happy to talk more about value, but the idea of value being way beyond price these days is really important, I think, to articulate too. Value is about getting the best quality that they can, making their dollar stretch the farthest. How does it fit into their lifestyle, the experience of eating, the taste? And so when they think about today's new value equation, of which price is just one factor, that's why I think we continue to see people being willing to pay more for protein sources, including animal protein.
We represent smaller processors, and a lot of them are doing, specific grass-fed, regenerative, organic. When it comes to value, how do some of those what you would call claims-based attributes fit into the equation?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the claims, what they all kind of share in terms of why consumers think they're important is this belief that they lead to better health. And so we know things like sustainability and the environment are important to some consumers, but what really drives most consumers when we're looking for those claims is a belief that the product will be of better quality, specifically because they see it as a healthier product. So because it was raised in a certain way, maybe processed in a certain way, there's these cues to consumers that therefore it's probably going to be a healthier end product, healthier for them, healthier for their kids. Now, having it be healthier for animals, the environment, all nice to have, but the reason they're willing to pay more for is because they think it's a health product. And we find that's driving what consumers are doing in the marketplace today more than anything other than taste.
Great, great. Chris, you have anything you want to jump in on here?
All super interesting. Yeah, when we look at the claims-based products that we work at, a lot of them are organic, grass-fed, regenerative. So I think that's where a lot of our folks tuning in are wanting to know, should they be looking at different spaces? Should they be looking at different areas? Or how do the products they make stack up in some of these different markets?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that's so interesting about organic, and we've been studying organic for over 30 years as well, is that it did kind of blossom out of this very kind of pro-environmental movement. That's where it started from. But where it really took off is when consumers started perceiving, and I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to say whether it's true or not, but the perception that organic meant it was healthier. And so, especially when we look at the fresh categories, that's where organic is so important to consumers. They have a hard time thinking about what organic might mean on a box of crackers, right? Because they don't really think about what's in that cracker. But when it comes to meat, when it comes to produce, when it comes to dairy, they have very clear perceptions about the lack of bad stuff in organic. And so that has been a real driver of organic. Now, I do want to say it doesn't just have to be organic. In fact, what we've seen over the past decade is a lot of the claims associated with organic stand alone on their own, right? So if a consumer is looking at a natural beef product and it's making claims about no antibiotics and no growth hormones and saying it was raised in a certain way, that's enough for a lot of consumers. So organic for many years was this sort of cue, right? This word that would make them feel like, even if they didn't know exactly what it was, that was a healthier product. Now, as they become more sophisticated and a little more articulate about what they want, there's a lot of other ways in. So I would say organic is absolutely a great way in. So is regenerative. So are claims about how the product was made. So are claims about where it was raised. So there's a lot more I think we can think about when it comes to the claim marketplace today. Organic really paved the way in terms of having that health connotation for consumers, but there's a lot of other space out there to play in. And I think the benefit of that is it might be at a price point that's more palatable to consumers. So we know organic can be expensive. We know it's a designation that carries a lot of goodwill and a lot of weight, but it also comes at a price point that some consumers may not be willing to pay. So I think thinking about what are the sort of all the wealth of claims out there that you think about what works for your operation, what's doable for you, that's still going to get you in that kind of special place in consumers' minds when it comes to that health benefit.
Well, and for our folks, that's, I think, very important. We stress that a smaller processor, if you're just producing a 1 pound brick of generic ground beef to go into Kroger and sit in the meat case next to their store brand, ground beef, that's not an area where we can compete.
Yeah.
It's trying to create that differentiated product that is important.
I love that point, Dave, because we know that store brand store brand holds a very high place in consumers' minds, right? Because number one, obviously the price, right? In many cases, entry level price, but more and more, so many of the retailers are starting to create store brands that have sort of a tiered offering. So they're offering natural, they're offering other things. So I think you're absolutely right that competing today's market, you need to have those claims to make you stand out from store brand, which for so many consumers is good enough these days. So we've got to stand apart from that.
You mentioned that your survey looked at all types of proteins, and I think 3, 4 years ago, those of us that are in the livestock or the meat business were afraid that everybody was going to be eating plant-based meats or something else, that was going to shove us out of the marketplace, and that's not coming to pass. What do you see happening with the alternative meat alternative sector?
Yeah, I think, just looking back a little bit, what happened? I think I'll go back to the first thing I said, which is taste. The taste didn't hold up, right? And so even though there were claims that it tasted as good or maybe tasted different, but still, wonderful, consumers, I think, overwhelmingly kind of pushed back and said, it actually doesn't taste as good. So I think that was one problem. I think the other big problem, big Achilles heel for a lot of those products was that they were introduced to the marketplace in a way that consumers thought they would be extremely healthy, right? That was the way in, was like, okay, we've got this healthier product. It's better for you. It's better for the environment, et cetera. And what consumers found as they got more educated is that those things had pretty long ingredient lists, and they didn't recognize a lot of things on that ingredient list. And they started hearing stories about how they were made. And so that processing, which in consumers' minds, for many years, we hear about fresh, real, less processed, really being the mantra of what consumers want: fresh, real, less processed. So when those products were introduced, there was a sense that, of course, they're going to be fresh, real, less processed. But in actual fact, once consumers got to know more, they started to think, wow, these products actually are pretty highly processed, and I don't really even understand what's in them. So I think in many cases, the sort of mitigation of that marketplace really kind of expanding more was this desire on the part of consumers to say, I actually think that maybe the real thing is better for me, that I don't know what all these other things are, this processing is. So as we look ahead, I think what that market's going to look like is another option, right? It's not going to overtake traditional animal-based proteins. It's not going to be the same size or anywhere close as traditional animal-based proteins. Will it be an option that some consumers choose sometimes? Absolutely. Will there be primarily just a really small group of consumers who eat it all the time? Yes. The level of vegans and vegetarians in the US has not remarkably increased in the last 10, 20 years. It's pretty much the same number. But more and more consumers are trying other forms of protein. So it will likely remain an option out there, but I don't think we're going to see the growth that we saw previously. It is sort of plateaued and has not obviously grown, and many in the industry are struggling right now.
Yeah, great, great. So, and just a reminder to folks, you can just type some questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those as they come in. Um, you look at different channels where people shop and eat, and what, particularly when you have a smaller processor that's not doing national distribution and the like, what are some of the things that you can share on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd say number one, it's actually there's some trends that are in favor of it going to smaller channels, meaning we just published a study on food sourcing in America, and we looked at 10 different channels for how to source food. And what we end up saying, and it's the subtitle of our report, is about fragmentation and focus. So what's happening is that the diversity of retail channels in terms of the consumer's repertoire of where they go to shop is expanding. So even just in the past 8 years, consumers have added in their past 30-day shoppings, 2 new banners. So they're now shopping about 8 different banners, 7 to 8 banners every month, right? So they're going to a club store, they're going to a grocery store, they're going to a natural food store, they're going to a specialist store, they're getting groceries at the drugstore. So they're expanding the number of channels and banners that they're going, rather than, they talk about one-stop shopping, but no one's really shopping that way. So they're going certain places for certain things. They're getting all their sort of shelf-stable stuff when they go on their shopping trip at Walmart. They're going to the supermarket on their way home to figure out what's for dinner that night. When they're buying their produce, they might be going to a Whole Foods. When they buy their meat, they might be going to a specialty meat purveyor. So this is really a positive thing, that the trends are in favor of this diversification of channels. And so I'd say, as a small producer, there's other ways into the shopper's basket. And especially as we think about, again, the fresh products are usually what drive shoppers to shop different channels: produce, meat, dairy. That's where they're going to specialists. So I'd say, whether it is through natural food stores, regional food stores, whether it's through specialty meat purveyors, whether it is direct to consumer or through a third party that can help you with that, those are all very viable ways. And I think your category is especially well positioned to do it that way, because that's how consumers, but that's what they think about when they say, I'm not going to go to my supermarket or the mass discount store for this. This category is really important to me. I'm going to go to the more specialist purveyor. So I think getting in through those natural and specialty stores, especially, is a great way to get into the consumer's basket.
And when you talk about the segmentation of consumers today and the changing demographics, who are the consumers that are really seeking out, again, a lot of the claims-based products, the non-GMO, regenerative, organic, etc.
Yeah, well, it's a diverse, it's a diverse set of consumers who want this because it is driven by health. And so we do find baby boomers starting to think about it as they think about their health and longevity and wellness and vitality. We do find the Gen Xers, who were the ones who were sort of first exposed to these products, are interested in them. Millennials, because they have growing families, and then the Gen Z as they start their own households. So I'd say it's more of an attitude than it is a life stage per se. That said, we know that millennials and Gen Z are especially likely to resonate with those claims. That they've grown up having more choices. They've grown up in an environment where they think about health and wellness a bit more often than some of the older generations did. And so we know that those younger consumers, and especially, those that are starting to have kids, because kids is a huge sort of gateway into healthier products and thinking about claims. We hear again and again that people say, I just kind of ate whatever. But then when I knew that I was going to have a child, we started looking at organic. We started thinking more carefully about what we were bringing to our households, putting in our bodies. And then I think Gen Z, even though their level of disposable income isn't as high, they're sort of struggling, many of them, they're still thinking about a lot of these claims and thinking about them being meaningful because of that health angle for many of them. They do think it's healthier. So I'd say the good news is there's a diverse set of consumers interested in these claims, but if you had to sort of choose, I'd say kind of those millennials who have these values, they've always had them, and then the Gen Z that are just starting to establish their own households, what they want to bring into their home. Those are good consumer groups because they already are fairly knowledgeable about many of the claims and ways of growing.
So we have a question coming in from Catherine in Maine, and she says, do you have similar data that reflects on the shopping patterns of communities of culture? Halal. Yesterday I had one with an African American, doing African food type things. So some of those cultural drivers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back to some of the comments I first made, just given the diversity of ethnicity and cultural heritage that we share in the US today, we know that is driving the search for different types of products. And what we find, I guess it probably isn't surprising, but for those folks who truly do need to seek a kosher diet or halal diet, that's a very viable group. But we're also finding that those words are becoming signifiers of clean, of fresh, of better for you to consumers who aren't raised in that cultural or have that heritage at all. And so I think there's a much larger marketplace for many of these types of designations than we even think, because consumers are using them as shorthand for some of the things that they're seeking. But absolutely, the rise of different cultural heritage and different styles of eating and customized diets is seeing a rise in all sorts of designation and claims. And we do have, we look at all different demographic groups in our research, so we can dig into some of those communities if we want to look at it by their kind of ethnicity. We don't ask a lot about halal and kosher specifically, just as an example in our study, but we hear about it qualitatively all the time as consumers say, well, that's sort of my way of knowing that the product is going to be better for me. And so I'll buy it even though I'm not following a strict diet that's kosher, for example.
So we're doing a lot of work these days on the other half of the animals, beyond your primal cuts and thing. Are you seeing anything going on with sort of those, you know, products made from offal or organ meat or anything like that in particularly within some of the cultural differences?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this general consensus about food waste that's starting to rise up. And so consumers, we never usually heard about like 10, 15 years ago in interviews. And then we started in the more recent past to hear about people concerned with food waste. And typically when they're thinking about in their kitchen. So they're thinking like, I just don't want to throw away all this food. Or why is there so much packaging, right? So it's kind of confined, it was confined to their household environment. But now we're seeing consumers think about it more broadly, just about waste in general, right? And whether they're hearing on the news about, produce going bad and the methane emissions contributing to climate change, or they're hearing about how much of a animal might not be utilized. And so that, I think, just in of itself is one of the trends that's happening here, this kind of general concern with waste and how it might be just impacting our environment. But also, I think it's part of this kind of movement towards wanting to embrace all different types of foods. Americans have been, I think, slow to embrace some of the global food flavors, but we're starting to now, and different styles of eating and different ways of eating. And I think part of that is eating different different parts of the animal. And so as we explore, and we have so much access to information now with social media and online, discovering new ways to eat and new types of things to eat is definitely part of, especially for those more food forward consumers, almost like a way to say, like, I'm interested in food and therefore I am a better person. And so I think there is this kind of cultural movement towards eating different parts of animals, as well as this movement away from waste, as well as what you said, Dave, which is just different cultural heritages and backgrounds introduce us to different, not just different types of meat on the same animal, but different animals, right? So experimenting with different types of protein sources, whether it's goat or other, all the way up to insect protein, which we've done some research on recently. So that is, I think, part of the expanding repertoire of the American consumer. It's going to come slower to a lot of mainstream consumers, but those more kind of trend leading consumers, the people that are especially interested in food, are definitely doing a lot of exploration right now. So I think that's an area of opportunity.
Great. Well, no, my background in the bison business, I'm always glad to hear people are exploring other things. Chris, do you have anything you want to add here?
A couple things. I was hoping maybe you weren't leading us to believe that we need to start making chocolate covered grasshoppers or crickets, but maybe that's the direction we all need to go. But
Well, it'd be good for the world, but no one really wants to do it because taste. Yeah.
we've touched on it a little bit, but some of the most successful groups that Dave and I get to work with are the local food producers, the family farm branded product producers that are actually able to raise the product, around their home, sell the product around their home, and to sell it to people that they know. And those local foods movements seem to be really picking up more momentum nationwide. Is there any data that you might have to, support that or work in conjunction with that from what we see on the ground?
Yeah, that idea of local is so important to consumers. And I think it's actually something that they're able to activate on more than they were in the past. So, again, like 10, 15 years ago, they'd talk about local foods and how they'd wanted to eat local. But it wasn't always very easy to do unless you had good access to farmers markets, right? Or you lived in a more rural community where you had those, you knew those people, they were in your community, you could buy from them. But I think that idea of local has so much positive connotation for consumers. I mean, some are just pragmatic, right? Like local means fresher. It hasn't traveled as far, right? You know exactly where it's coming from. It's not on a truck or something. So freshness is a part of it. But there's also this real values driven element, like people wanting to support the local economy, wanting to support their local community, wanting to support their neighbors. And so it is about the product at some level because they see it as healthier. But there's also this idea of shared values that we see driving that quite a bit. And then up for other people, it's about, not traveling as far. There's environmental benefits. There's a sense that if you're buying from a neighbor, they probably share the same values that you do, right? That around production, around whether or not you'd want to use things that consumers wouldn't want in their food. So the local movement, I think, has always been a desire on the part of consumers to eat a certain way, but it wasn't something they could actually activate on because it was so difficult to do. But with the advent now of these local communities, as you say, starting to figure out like people sharing cows, right? Or people participating in not just kind of CSAs, but beyond just produce into other parts of the food chain. Now that it's something that's more real, we find consumers are wanting to express their desires around that and buy that way. And we're finding, I think, which is good news, is that they're willing to pay a bit more for it too. And so they know that there's going to be some added costs, and it's somehow much more palatable when you know it's going to a neighbor, to your community. And I say neighbor, but I mean like kind of in your local community. That seems like the willingness to pay more is there. So yeah, I think it's great that there's things happening on the ground. It's still not available to everyone, although we also find, I need to point out that the idea of locale is also important. So let's say someone's online and they're ordering something, even though it might be coming from a little bit further away, if they know where it's coming from, if they've gotten to know the farmer, if they've gotten to know the rancher, whoever it is who's growing that, it is the sense of locale, right? That it incorporates local, even though it's not geographically local, but this idea that you're now part of a community and you know the people in that community who are making the product. Really important. So I think there's some unique ways, given technology, that idea of local can be interpreted in a much broader way than just geographically local.
Yeah. And I think there's a direct tie to the ingredient list that you mentioned earlier. Local foods are not using typically the preservatives, gases and things like that to improve the shelf life of their products. So if you're buying produce direct from the local farmer or buying meat from the local processor, that ingredient list count goes way down. So they're not having to preserve that shelf life for months potentially or longer to get it to the end consumer. So we see a lot of benefits around the local foods.
Great.
Yep. Yep. And we have a lot of folks that we're working with. In fact, we did a roundtable a couple months ago on um, the digital, doing direct to consumer, online marketing and the like. What do you see in some of the trends there? I mean, that's where they're promoting locale.
Hmm.
This is grass fed, beef coming from Mississippi from my farm, but it's being shipped to North Carolina. What do you see with some of that?
Well, I think that kind of gets back to what's driving the desire for these sorts of products, which is this kind of this health benefit, right? And so I think for many of those consumers, they're willing to overlook some things like maybe the environmental right piece of it, right? That's being shipped so far that, well, that's not as important to many of those consumers. They're getting a really high quality product. They know it's going to taste good. They know it's going to be healthier, and they felt like they built a relationship online. I mean, I think that's what's so interesting, right, about online is people feel like they have all these friends and relationships, and they may have never physically met the person that they feel like they have these relationships with. It's been built online. And so I think that's good news for folks who maybe that's a way to reach out and build a business. And what people want to know there is that there's still the human connection, right? So still telling them the story of how that cattle was raised, how that product's raised, how it's a family farm, whatever the kind of the special elements of your production are, being able to talk about that in the online forum. So we think D2C absolutely. It's something that especially for these kind of higher end specialty products is important, because for some people they don't have a natural food store nearby. They don't have a specialty meat purveyor nearby. So being able to still have access to those products no matter where they are via the online medium can be of huge benefit. And again, you got to tell that story, right? What is that locale, right? That so you're in a different state, you're across the country, but you can still tell your story in a way that's going to make the consumer feel like they have a human connection to you.
Well, and that kind of leads into one of the questions that was submitted ahead of time was that that the grass-fed label is getting very pervasive now. You see that a lot in Kroger, in Walmart, and the like. Um, what are some of the best ways for a smaller producer, smaller processor to break into that market?
Yeah, I think it's differentiating beyond the claim, right? So it's putting a lot of pressure on you as a small producer, but that's sort of your way in, right? When we've got grass fed being now at scale, right? Store brand, large purveyors, they're not telling the story. They're making a good claim, and that claim's important. But as with anything, things evolve, right? So as organic becomes more normalized, you got to think about, okay, what's beyond organic, right? Is it regenerative or what is it? And I think in a similar fashion, like, yes, grass-fed is definitely something consumers are seeking, but now what can you as a small purveyor talk about beyond that? Can you talk about, to the extent that you can, right? And online you certainly can, where specifically it comes from. What specific techniques did you use when that cattle was being raised? Talking about what your farm or your ranch looks like. So I think it's going beyond just the claim and telling more of the story. Easier said than done, but definitely something you can do if you get into the specialty purveyors, if you're doing online, harder at kind of the mass and the grocery stores. But as you said yourself, Dave, those aren't necessarily the places you want to compete. You want to think about how you can really tell that unique story that's going to give you the edge. And again, importantly, mean that someone's probably willing to pay more above and beyond what grass-fed might be. If it's grass-fed and they know it's coming from this single ranch in X state, that's going to give them a higher price point in their head of what they're willing to pay for.
Well, the thing I've noticed with grass-fed too is, and this is just anecdotal, but when people see grass-fed, they kind of equate that with local,
Yeah.
smaller farm. And yet, when you go into the mainstream stores and you flip over that package, so much of that is coming in from Uruguay or New Zealand or Australia. Um, in Again, the messaging, telling the story about that, I think is probably critical.
Yeah, and even, years ago, we started seeing kind of made in the US being such an important claim to consumers. It gets back to the idea of wanting to support kind of whatever you consider your local community. So I do think domestic production is something that's important in today's world. Politics aside, it's just always been there. It's been something that can, you want to support kind of the domestic economy in the same way you want to support the local economy. So I do think that in of itself is an important claim today. Again, it harkens back to also things like not traveling as far, right? Fresher, probably better for you, maybe made in a way that you are going to think there's a variety of other claims attributed to as well, such as, humane slaughter or other things. So yeah, I think that in of itself is important. If we can layer that onto grass-fed, that could make a product more distinct from the competition.
Mm. And I know, and Chris had this with a processing plant he developed with the Quapaw Nation here about 10 years ago, that not only processing your own animals, but doing some co-packing for other things. And we have some other processors that are looking at that. What are some of the, I guess, opportunities to maybe work with a local retailer or a natural food store or something like that to do some co-packing under their brand name?
Yeah, I think that right now it kind of goes back to when I was talking about the fragmentation of retailer. Retailers are nervous about this fragmentation, right? Because it means like there's so many places now consumers can buy food. I mean, I always think back to like dollar stores, right? 20 years ago, you were lucky if you could find a can of beans in a dollar store, and you walk into a dollar store today and there's fresh meat and there's prepared foods and there's produce. So there's just such high competition in retail today. So what we talk to retailers a lot about is how can you partner with your providers, your food and beverage providers, to provide unique offerings for your customers, reasons for them to come to your store. So we know people are going certain places for certain things. So we're telling retailers, find those the food purveyors that can bring you something special, different. How can they help you build the brand? And so we actually are, some of the retailers we're working with, we're helping advise them on how they can find those products, whether they're products that no one else can, you can't find anywhere else but your store, or even working with some of the bigger producers to find like different cuts of meat or different pack sizes, different things that might be exclusive in that particular retailer versus other retailers. So I think it actually provides sort of a unique opportunity, because retailers, I think, are more open to some of those conversations today than they were before, because they're relying upon some of their producers to be the ones that help make them a destination, to help give them that strength they need to be different and stand out. So I think it's, yeah, having exclusive access, having them to help you tell your story, which becomes a story for them, right? They're getting some benefit out of that, right? Being able to say that's part of their brand equity to have these special products in store. I think they're probably more open than they were in the past to these conversations, giving that fragmentation that's happening at retail and their fears about what they stand for in today's marketplace.
So you've got some experience doing that type of work.
Yeah, and it's trying to make the product stand out. That's been a big thing, and we've seen that across the nation when Dave and I are doing site visits and looking at even back to the small town general stores coming back on Main Street. We see more and more of those with the butcher shop and the meat shops and food processing and all kinds of things. There's a lot of things coming back that you hadn't seen for the last 10 years as much, but it's interesting to see, and really interesting to see what does the future hold for us ahead. And I don't know how far out maybe some of your data might go, Laurie, but where do you see the markets and the trends going over the next 3 to 5 years? Are the local foods and organic and natural and all these claims based foods, do you see them being even more relevant in future markets?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been around the block for a long time, right? I remember back in 2008 when we had the recession, and the first thing so many people said is, "Oh, that natural foods market's going to die," right? No one's going to pay money when we're in a recession. And we actually found that the natural food market grew at a faster clip than the overall food marketplace back in that recession. And I think one of the things that pointed out was these things matter to people, right? Eating in a way that they perceive to be healthier and better is something that's going to stand up. And so we saw back then that people were making trade-offs. They'd say, yep, I'm going to keep buying the organic meat and the organic milk. Maybe I won't worry about it in other categories, but I'm going to buy it. And maybe that means my kids won't get as many new clothes this year for school, right? So they're making trade-offs because food, and I think if anything, food has become more important, and that link to health has become even stronger. And we continue to see that. So even the past couple of years, right, which have been, challenging, and because of the pandemic, because of, this fear of recession, this kind of state of frugality that so many consumers live in, nervousness about the economy, we're still seeing all of these health related products and claims stand up very well. And so I think what that really shows is this is not a fad. This is not just a blip in time. It's not just because people had some extra disposable income and it was kind of cool. This is something that really matters. And this idea that what you put in your body is a huge part of your health outcomes is a belief that consumers share. Doesn't mean everyone's a healthy consumer. It doesn't mean that all of us probably have things where I should probably, drink more water, take the stairs more often, XYZ, right? But overall, what we find is across most consumers is this desire for better health. And so I think as we look ahead, we don't think this is going to slow down. Now, will it evolve and change? Absolutely, right? No one knew what regenerative farming was 20 years ago. And now people are starting to sort of get it or talk about things that have to do with regenerative. So we're constantly in the state of consumers learning more, knowledge being exchanged. Sometimes it's bad information, sometimes it's not true. But I think the thread that we see is this desire that they connect food to health and that they're looking for claims that they feel are going to be better for the health of their kids, the health of themselves is going to continue. And it's going to evolve, right? And things will come and go, and maybe things will pass by, but this sort of mantra around more protein, less sugar, I think will continue to gain steam. That's, if you look at all the customized diets, many of them share this kind of lots of protein and far less sugar. So we think there's gonna be a lot of changes that are happening in the sweetener marketplace and the sugar marketplace. Things will continue to evolve, but they're going to be on this trajectory towards consumers finding more products they believe are healthy for them, better for them. And they're going to get much more nosy and interested in how products are made, right? And I think if anything, with some of what's going on with the MAHA movement, this desire on the part of consumers to know what's in their food, what does it do, what's it made out of, will continue. So they're going to be seeking more and more knowledge, and with a story that we can go to them around, this thing is just meat, right? There's nothing else in it. It is what you anticipate to be in it, is going to be a strong way to continue, no matter what happens with changes in policies, changes in consumer preferences. Health and wellness is here to stay, and they're going to be seeking out claims that lead them to believe the products are better for them.
And that kind of touches on the focus that has come on with ultra processed foods
Yes.
in the last few months. I imagine that's probably likely to accelerate that trend of looking for fewer ingredients and cleaner labels.
Yeah, I mean, I think even consumers who can't really define what an ultra processed food is, what they look for, they say, are a short ingredient list, so I don't want too many things in it, words I recognize, and if I don't recognize them, at least they don't have any X's, Y's, or Z's in them. Because those words have X's, Y's, and Z's in them are probably bad for you. They're probably chemicals or additives or preservatives. Again, not entirely true, but they've got these sort of like shorthand ways that they're assessing products. So I think even for those consumers who aren't like doing a lot of information seeking or a lot of due diligence, are still in many cases flipping something over and kind of just eyeballing it and looking at it. In the same way they're looking at it and saying, how many grams of protein are in it? Or how few grams of sugar. So I think for mainstream America, that what's going on with kind of just more inquiry into how food is made and what's in it is going to have an impact in how they're making decisions.
Messaging for a smaller processor to try and emphasize that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for the smaller processors, they're the ones that are going to have the products that are most in alignment with where consumer preferences are going, right? I mean, that's the good news is I think the challenge is always, okay, now operationally, how do we get that information to them? How can I do it when I don't have a huge marketing budget? How can I do it when I'm not a whiz at telling my story online? How can I do it when I don't have those retailer partnerships yet? The good news is, I think the hardest part is having the products that are right. And as we look at the big guys, right, the big food companies, they're in a situation where they don't have the products that suit a lot of these needs that consumers are looking for. And that's the hard part, right? They're reformulating, they're reassessing, they're trying to figure out to do these iconic brands. For the small producers, they already have the product right. They have the story right. They have the information. It's just now figuring out what's the conduit to get that information, that messaging to consumers so they choose my product.
Yeah. I see we have a question from Arthur. He says, how do the spending patterns change within income groups for proteins, health and nutrient dense foods?
Yeah, I don't have a specific answer to that, but what we do know is that consumers of all incomes are willing to pay for what they care about, right? And so it's not unusual for us to shop with a consumer who may not have a lot of disposable income, but she's still going to buy certain categories that she thinks is healthier and pay more for them because it's so important to her. But we do see trends when we look at those most health engaged consumers. They do over index for being in the higher income brackets. So there certainly is a skew where we'd say more than we would anticipate when we look at the general population. People in higher income brackets do spend more on some of these health and wellness products. But we also find there are people who are, single income families, people who are maybe struggling, jobs are getting eliminated, that there's certain food products that are still so important to them, they're willing to pay more. What we are finding is there are some trade-offs being made within categories. So for example, we hear again and again, people say, I love beef. I really love beef. And I used to always get the strip steak, but now I'm buying skirt steak and I'm finding new ways to make it. So we do see trade-offs being made. We don't see necessarily people leaving the category, but we do see them doing things like trading out different cuts of beef, or maybe saying, I can't afford the organic, but I'm going to buy the one that still has claims around, no hormones and no antibiotics. And so there is this desire still to eat similar products, but maybe making some changes therein. So yes, to answer the question, income does play a role, but that's not to say that it's just the high income folks who are driving the move towards health and wellness products. That's not true at all.
An interesting point and something that Dave and I see regularly that ties to the different types of products being used is we see a lot of local processors that are even adding recipes online to show
Right.
people how to use those middle meats or less popular cuts, not only to help them move them, but also to diversify that marketplace a little bit and to help the consumer understand how to use it, how to cook it, and to keep that product flowing and just adds more diversification to the entire marketplace. So we're definitely happy to see that. But another question I had and something that came up on our questions that were submitted ahead of time, the subscription box services, the food boxes, meat boxes, we saw some trends over the years, the last several years of, ups and downs with those subscription services and box services. Are you seeing any trends with that or track any data on those?
We do. We ask about that in our surveys, and we've seen it sort of plateau in the last year or two. So I think it's something that for the most dedicated consumers, they really appreciate and understand. And I think there was a lot of experimentation that went on, especially during the COVID years, where people didn't want to necessarily go to the stores for a little while there. And I think what we found is that for a lot of consumers, they didn't know what to do with it, even though the recipe was there, right? They still struggled with how to make it at home. They felt like they were getting a lot of it and they didn't use it. So there was waste happening. So I think what we've seen is sort of like this natural plateauing now of the people who feel comfortable with those. There is still some experimentation going on and exploration, but it's not near the levels that we saw even a couple of years ago. So I think that it's certainly one way to get into the consumer's home, but I think from a kind of a scale perspective, it's going to be a challenging way to reach a lot of people because we're kind of back to the way that we traditionally shopped pre-COVID as well. I think to your point that you made about inspiration recipes, that's a huge driver or barrier, right? Consumers don't know what to do with something. They don't know how to make it. And we find that, for example, TikTok being used as a search engine today. People are going on TikTok. The number one thing, if they're using TikTok as a search engine, is recipes. Number one. So I think that really shows that there's still this desire for consumers to get recipes and get the inspiration. And that's a great way, especially with those less familiar cuts of meat, to get into their homes. So I think you're right. That's something we continue to see and we want to continue to do a good job of as we get into other parts of the animal product, for example, or people want to cook with different sorts of spices and tastes and flavors, or maybe not grill anymore, figure out how to make it inside. So I think there's a diversity of ways that we can get into consumers' homes, and that inspiration is really a big part of it.
There's been a trend over the last few years with like heat and eat recipes, having products that have some marinade in them or less preparation time. Um, do you see that seem to grow and then it seemed to plateau? Do you see that continuing to grow? How does that fit within generations?
It's funny, I was just going to say that. So generations, when we survey the Gen Xers and the boomers across the board, they're like, yeah, I've kind of had it with cooking. I'm done. I don't really want to have to do much anymore. It's kind of, but the younger generations, they see cooking, being creative in the kitchen as like this aspiration they have. Like it's just a moral good if you know how to cook a little bit, as we're finding amongst the younger generations. And they like cooking, whereas the older generations are like, that's it. So I do think there is some generational piece playing a role here. And one kind of step into cooking for those younger consumers who don't feel like they have a lot of skills is almost more like food prep, right? Like someone's already done the hard work. We call it like the sous chef, right? Like someone's done the hard work of making like the sauce or cutting up the beef the right way. And now I'm gonna do it in my kitchen, but all I really have to do is like put it in a skillet, right? And that's cooking, right? So it's not scratch cooking anymore, but it's still considered cooking. So I think this idea of kind of doing the hard work for the consumer, but letting them still have a little creativity, do a little customization in the kitchen is very appealing to some of the younger cohorts. To some of the older cohorts, they're sort of like, yeah, I'm done. Like, I just give me the food. I want it to be finished, or I want to go out to eat, or so I do think there's a generational skew. And I think it's really finding the sweet spot between letting them do a little bit of the preparation, but not having to do all of the hard stuff. And part of that hard stuff is the meat prep. Frankly, we find that a lot is it's just, they're not, you know, they're hoping someone else can do the hard work of some of the butchering and the cutting and maybe even the marinating. And then they can just kind of have the glory of finishing the product and serving it.
Yeah. Well, I think that ties in too when people are trading off. A strip steak you can throw on the grill and it's going to come out pretty good. A skirt steak, maybe you need to do some,
Some heavy lifting.
marinating or
Yep.
sous vide or whatever
Yep.
to make that a little more. So, Mark, yeah, has asked, could we get a summary of the main points and the data, et cetera, a short written summary? And just for your information, Mark, yeah, we usually put together a little FAQ sheet after these, but yesterday we just posted the latest quarterly marketplace update that we do on a quarterly basis, and it has some of the things in there, particularly talking about demographic changes and some of the things there. So that's available for download off of our toolkit. Um, Lori, talk about some of the sources that where our folks could go to find some data that can be helped. Some of the things that you've covered. I know Hartman's a great resource, but what are some other things, particularly for those that don't have a big marketing budget? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great information buried in some of what the government puts out, especially the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's where we find a lot of our own cultural trends, some of the food, getting the name right now, but they put out kind of like retail food sales. And you can see trends in different types of pockets of the sector. You got to kind of dig through it, but there's a lot of information there, especially for folks who might be savvy about digging into the data and doing a little of the analysis. There's a lot that lives out there. The Food Marketing Institute, which is a member-based organization, but they put out a lot of information for free, and they do like the Power of Meat, which is a special report they put out that I think might be accessible, or at least pieces of it without being a member. So we find there's good info there. I mean, we ourselves, yes, we certainly are a for-profit business, but we put a lot of free information in our newsletters, just kind of as hooks, as snapshots for information. So I think there are certainly some third parties, especially some of the agencies out there that have good information that's being put into the marketplace that you can access online. Even something like Statista, which has like charts and such that you can look at for free, that goes into some of the sectors and sales there, is good information as well.
And we do have a summary, and I think I need to actually just jog my memory here, that a summary of some links to sources of that type of information, U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and National Ag Statistics Service and ERS and the like. So we'll update that and get it into our toolkit. Also, the Food Marketing Institute, I know, just to go in there, you don't have to be a member, but I think the Power of Meat report, I mean, that's $500, but if you're a non-member, but that's, to me, is $500 well spent, because that's just a gold mine of information in that report.
Agreed.
Yep. So
Dave, it
I'm
looks
kind of
like there might
getting.
be someone with their hand up. Rudy?
Oh, I'm glad you. Let's see, Rudy, can you type in your question into the Q&A? See if we could get that. So, um, what are some of the, are you seeing with some of the regional differences, regional drivers in the marketplace these days?
Yeah, when it comes to health and wellness trends, we do see that some of it's driven by the more urban areas. So just in terms of what's available, what's accessible, sometimes higher income brackets there. So we do see some geographic regional variation. I think what's interesting though is this kind of desire to live longer and live better is it's very pervasive across the US. Now there might be more accessibility in some of like the coasts, and then if you're like Chicago or Minneapolis or some of the urban areas, there's just more options available in a diversity of different retail formats. But this sort of like kind of wanting to be healthier, live longer, live better, vitality, longevity is sort of what we call it. We find that to be quite pervasive. Different levels of interest in different categories, right? So there might be pockets of folks who are more interested in animal-based products versus plant-based, but we're really finding more than anything today, you can have a national strategy because so many people are kind of resonating around many of these claims and these call outs on products and associating it back to health.
Good. The gosh, and it just evaporated. Um, here with I know what it was, is that we've seen over the last couple of years that the food service market has really struggled. People are doing more in-home cooking in restaurants, and we've seen places like Bennigan's and these sort of fast casual or casual dining places have been losing money. But it seems like there's more independent restaurants coming about. And what are some of the opportunities for folks to partner with those outlets?
Yeah, and I should note, and this is government data again, we just saw in 2025, revenue at food service surpassed food at retail. So this is the first time ever that now food service is ahead in terms of revenue. Now it might have to do the pricing, et cetera. And we know there are a lot of chains that have struggled, like you said. But when you look across sector, includes fast food, independents, everyone, they actually, in terms of dollars, are doing quite well. They've really rebounded from COVID. But I think it gets back to sort of what we talked about with the specialty retailers, whether it's a one-off store, in the same way these restaurants are trying to be distinctive in a highly competitive environment, and to get consumers in their stores, having them have exclusive products, right? And everyone's been to restaurants, right, where they're listing where things came from, tend to be higher end. But there's even now a lot of kind of like mid-tier restaurants and the independents especially that are wanting to call out their purveyors, call out where the producers are, because it gives them something special and distinctive versus competition. So in the same way that a retailer might want to make their products stand out and be exclusive, we're seeing that happen in the retail business. And I think that move towards more independence is of benefit again to the small purveyors, because you can partner with them in a way that's going to be a much, lower barrier to entry than it is with a large food service chain.
Great, great. Folks, this is your last opportunity to type in a question for Lori here. But Chris, yeah, you
Yeah,
want to?
real quick, something else that I've seen in the last couple of years are the little QR codes going on the labels. You talk about telling the story and telling, about the products and where it came from. When you don't have a lot of marketing space on labels for food, and you don't always have a chance to put a banner in your local store, but those little QR codes work. And even if you're working with a restaurant to get your food into that restaurant, a lot of times they're pretty good about branding that product on the menu or adding the QR codes on the menu so you can see where the products came from. So that the true farm to table experience is there. When you're waiting for your food, you can just scan through and say, hey, this is where the produce came from, or this is where the meat came from. Those are really fairly simple ways to help tell that story and to help build that brand identity for the products you're making. So I know we have a question here from Catherine too, Dave. You want to hit that one?
Yeah. It says, have you explored market trends with meal subscriptions, but on a local level? For example, producers collaborating to create recipes, complete ingredients, and sell as a box within a local retail store instead of online. Something along the lines of that.
We have not done research on that specifically, but I think there's a lot of elements there that would appeal to consumers. Getting back to kind of local, like in my community and my neighborhood, as well as not having to have it shipped. So I know there's a proximity there that's important to me, so I can still get it at the retail store. We always talk just real quickly about kind of the trifecta of what they want when they go into grocery, which is like, give me inspiration for me to cook for dinner, put all the products in one place so I don't have to run all over the store, have it on an end cap, and give me a good deal on it. And so I think that's sort of those three things are sort of what the question is about there. Like, can you get everything together? Can you give them the inspiration and maybe make it a little less expensive than if they were having to go to all these specialist purveyors? So I love that idea, but I don't have research on it.
Great, great. And finally, we're at the top of the hour, so just any closing thoughts, Lori?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. It's been a fun conversation. I don't have anything else that I could add.
So, okay, well, and Nicole is putting up your information. So, Lori is great if you want to drop her an email on some things. And again, I've had the pleasure of working with Lori for, oh gosh, past 25 years, I guess, in some things. Hartman is a great source of information. So, as she said, there's a lot of stuff that they put out in their newsletter and a lot of free information. So, make sure you get on there for their newsletter. So with that, you're going to get a 2-question survey here momentarily. Please fill that out. Let us know what you thought about our conversation today and what you'd like to see us cover in the future. We're trying to put together some ideas going forward, and we will be looking forward to going through all of that information. So thank you, everybody, for being with us today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.